All right, so let's talk about Carl Jung. You've probably heard of his ideas, right? Things like introverts, extroverts, the collective unconscious. They're everywhere. But to really get what he was talking about, you have to go back. You have to understand the pretty strange and fascinating world that made him.
And it really starts here. Get this. Jung's grandfather on his mother's side, he kept an empty chair at the table for the ghost of his dead wife. And he would actually talk to her. You can just imagine how his second wife, the one who was still alive, felt about that. This kind of mystical, occult stuff, it was just baked into the family.
And then there was his mom. Jung said she was like two different people. During the day, she was your normal, warm, practical mother. But at night, whoa, something else came out. He called it her night personality. She'd become this kind of mystical, almost spooky, clairvoyant figure. Talk about a split.
So, with a grandfather talking to ghosts and a mother with a secret night self, is it any surprise that Carl Jung himself felt this exact same split? Yeah, from the time he was a little kid, he was absolutely convinced he had two different people living inside him. And that feeling, that internal division, well, it became the central struggle of his entire life. But it was also the source of his most brilliant ideas.
Okay, so let's dive into this idea. Jung's whole childhood was basically a house divided, a constant pull between two completely opposite forces.
So on one hand, you had his dad's side of the family. Very rational, very respectable. We're talking medicine, Protestant ministry. There were even these rumors they were related to the famous poet Goethe, super buttoned up. But then, on his mother's side, it was a totally different story. Theology, yeah, but also this deep family tradition of spiritualism and the occult. So you can see, Jung was literally caught between science and a seance.
And Jung basically took this whole family conflict and internalized it. He actually named his two inner selves. Personality number one was the public Jung, the everyday schoolboy, the future scientist. He was extroverted, focused on the real objective world. But then there was personality number two. That was his secret, private self, super introverted, totally intuitive, and connected to, something much deeper and older.
So this deep internal split, it wasn't just going to stay inside him. It was about to explode onto the world stage. Because Jung's search for a kind of father figure, it led him straight to the doorstep of the father of psychoanalysis himself, Sigmund Freud.
And their connection, it was instant. It was electric. The very first time they met in 1907, they talked for 13 hours straight. Can you imagine? Freud was convinced he'd found his heir, the crown prince who would carry on his legacy. But it didn't last. Just 2 years later, on a trip to America, you could start to see the cracks forming. And by 1913, boom, it was over. The friendship, the collaboration, all of it.
So what was the breaking point? Well, it all came to a head on that America trip. They were analyzing each other's dreams, as you do, and Jung asked Freud for some personal details about one of his dreams to help figure it out. And Freud just shut him down. He said, "But I cannot risk my authority." And for Jung, this man who was all about diving deep into the psyche no matter what, hearing that was it. In that one moment, all of Freud's authority just vanished for him.
And look, this split wasn't just about some dry academic theory. It was intensely personal. For one thing, Jung had told Freud he had a religious crush on him with, quote, an erotic undertone. And this was all tied up with a terrible sexual assault he'd experienced as a teenager by a man he admired. Plus, you had Jung's whole number two personality, that mystical, intuitive side, which just slammed right into Freud's super rigid scientific view of the world. And then there was Jung's personal life. The guy lived with both his wife, Emma, and his mistress, Toni Wolff, and actually believed that infidelity was, get this, a prerequisite for a good marriage. Yeah, that didn't exactly jive with Freud's more conventional values. So you can imagine breaking with his spiritual father like that. It absolutely devastated him. It sent Jung spiraling into a deep, profound crisis. But here's the thing about Jung. For him, this breakdown was also a breakthrough. It was a terrifying journey for sure, but it was also a necessary one. A journey right into the heart of his own mind. He actually had a name for this period, his creative illness. And that's the key word, right? Creative. From about 1913 to 1917, he wasn't just, falling apart. He was actively exploring. He basically turned his powerful mind inward and decided to deliberately face the chaos of his own unconscious. He treated his own psyche like it was this vast, undiscovered continent.
And this is so important. This wasn't some random slide into madness, not at all. It was a systematic journey. He actually developed a method for it. First, he'd write down every detail of his dreams. Then, he'd use something he called active imagination. He would draw, he would paint, he would write stories about the visions he was having, just following them wherever they took him. And finally, he would directly confront the figures and voices that came out of his inner world. He literally had conversations with them.
So, what did he find on this incredibly dangerous inner voyage? Well, what he brought back became the bedrock of his entire life's work. And you have to understand, these weren't just theories he cooked up in his study. He saw them as discoveries, like treasures he'd pulled up from the deepest parts of his own soul.
And with these treasures, he basically drew a map of the unconscious mind. He came up with the idea of the collective unconscious, this idea that we're all born with a shared psychic inheritance from our ancestors. And inside that, he found what he called archetypes. These are universal patterns or figures, like the anima, which is the inner feminine side of a man, or the shadow, that dark part of ourselves we all try to push down and hide. And all of this led to his concept of individuation, which is basically the lifelong journey of meeting and integrating all these different parts of yourself to become a whole person.
So after coming back from this intense inner journey, Jung had finally done it. He'd integrated those two sides of himself, personality number 1 and number 2. And for the rest of his long life, he pretty much became the living embodiment of one of his own famous archetypes.
He lived all the way to 85. And by the time he passed away in 1961, he wasn't just a psychologist anymore. He was known all over the world as the wise old man of Küsnacht. His influence had spread into philosophy, religion, even art. He had finally truly united those two dueling personalities inside him.
When you look at it, Jung's entire life is this incredible testament to the power of our inner world. His story suggests that looking at the strange, even frightening parts of ourselves isn't something to be scared of. It's not a path to madness. In fact, it might just be the path to a much richer, more whole life. And that really just leaves us with one big question to think about for ourselves.
All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're exploring the mind through the eyes of one of psychology's most interesting and maybe mysterious thinkers, Carl Jung. He gave us this incredible map of the human psyche, one that suggests we're connected not just to our own past, but to the entire history of humanity. So, let's start that journey.
So when you think of psychology, you probably think of Sigmund Freud, right? His whole thing was that we're driven by our own personal, often repressed experiences. But Jung, who started as Freud's student, took a massive turn. He looked past our individual lives and said, no, a huge part of what motivates us comes from the inherited experiences of our ancestors. It's a total game changer, shifting from the personal to the ancient.
So, how in the world do you even begin to grasp something like an ancestral past living inside you? Well, Jung didn't just throw the idea out there, he drew a map, a detailed map of the psyche. And that's exactly what we're going to explore. We're taking a guided tour of the mind, Jung's way.
Our tour has 3 main levels. We're going to start on the surface, with the conscious mind. Then we'll go a layer deeper into the personal unconscious, which is where your own unique history is stored. And finally, we're going to plunge into the deepest, most fascinating layer of all, the collective unconscious.
Okay, first stop, the conscious. This is the part of you that's paying attention right now. It's everything you're aware of, the you think you are. But for Jung, this is just the tiny visible tip of a massive iceberg.
Right at the center of this conscious world is what Jung called the ego. Think of the ego as the CEO of your awareness. It manages what you see, think, and feel. But, and this is a really big but, the ego is not the real you. It's not the core of your personality. It's just the part holding the flashlight in a very, very big room.
In fact, Jung would say that if we get too focused on our conscious ego, we're setting ourselves up for some serious psychological imbalance. To be a whole, healthy person, you can't just hang out in the brightly lit part of your mind. You have to be willing to explore what's in the dark. The real core of who you are is buried much, much deeper.
So let's take that first step down into the personal unconscious. This layer is all about you, your story, your journey, your life.
The personal unconscious is kind of like your mind's own private storage unit. It's a container that holds every single thing you've ever experienced that you aren't thinking about right now. We're talking repressed memories, things you've forgotten, even stuff you only perceived on the edge of your awareness. It's your own personal psychic archive.
Now, what's really interesting is how this stuff is stored. It's not filed away neatly. Instead, it clumps together around certain emotional themes. Jung called these clumps complexes. A complex is basically a knot of ideas and memories, all tied together and supercharged by a powerful emotion.
For example, let's talk about a mother complex. You might think that's just about your relationship with your actual mom, but for Jung, it's so much bigger. It's this powerful mix of your personal history with her, plus your conscious ideas about what a mother is, and, here's the twist, it taps into humanity's collective ancient experience of motherhood itself. You can see how all these layers start to bleed into each other.
And that brings us to a really mind-bending question. This is where Jung truly goes off the map of other psychologists. What if your mind contains feelings, images, and instincts that you never personally experienced? What if parts of your mind are literally inherited?
This brings us to the deepest, the most profound, and, the most controversial level of Jung's map, the collective unconscious. This isn't your personal story anymore. This is our story, the story of every human who has ever lived. The collective unconscious is basically a shared psychic inheritance. Jung believed that all the universal experiences of our ancestors, things like birth, death, God, love, fear, all of that left an imprint. This imprint gets passed down through the generations not as a specific memory, but as a kind of psychic potential, a blueprint for how to experience the world.
So what does this actually feel like in real life? Well, you don't inherit the idea of a mother. You inherit the innate tendency to feel that overwhelming, instant love for your newborn baby. It's that crazy, shocking jolt of love at first sight. You see a stranger, and it feels like you've known them forever. Or it's when you have one of those big dreams, the kind that feels ancient and full of symbols that seem to mean something to everyone everywhere. That's the collective unconscious bubbling up.
Jung himself put it perfectly. He called these inherited potentials forms without content. Think of it like a mold or a template. It's an empty shape that's just waiting for your personal experience to come along and fill it in, giving it substance. These forms are what he famously called the archetypes.
So we've toured the conscious, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. But why? What's the point of knowing all this? For Jung, understanding this whole structure was the key to achieving the ultimate goal of life, finding balance.
He called this ultimate goal self-realization. It's the journey of becoming a whole, complete individual. And the only way to get there, he said, is by recognizing and integrating all the opposing forces inside you. It's about bringing every part of yourself, the good, the bad, the light, the shadow, into a working harmony.
And that's really the heart of it. Jung's whole theory is a big collection of these opposites. A healthy mind doesn't pick a side. It's not about choosing the conscious over the unconscious, or being rational instead of irrational. It's about holding the tension between them. It's about knowing you have both an introverted side and an extroverted side, a logical mind and deep instincts. Wholeness isn't about being one thing. It's about being balanced.
And that's what we'll end on. Jung's map of the mind leaves us with this huge, profound question to think about. It's a question that connects your most private feelings to the grand, sweeping story of humanity. So think about it. What parts of you are echoes from a distant human past? When you feel something powerful and unexplainable, is it just you? Or are you feeling an echo from something we all share?
Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving deep. We're going on a journey into one of the most mysterious, most fascinating places you could ever explore, your own mind. And our guide is going to be one of the great pioneers of psychology, Carl Jung. So let's start with a big question. One that Jung believed was maybe the most important question you could ever ask yourself. Who are you? I mean, who are you really? Not the version you show your boss or your friends, but the person behind that mask. Jung's whole idea was that just beneath the surface, there's this hidden world, a kind of inner cast of characters that are shaping pretty much everything you think and do.
All right, so the first character we need to meet on this inner journey is the one we already know pretty well. It's the one we introduce to everybody else.
Jung had a name for this, the persona. You can just think of it as your public face. It's the professional bedside manner a doctor puts on. It's the confident, unshakable face of a politician. It's the role you play at work or even at a party. And look, it's not a bad thing. It's actually a necessary tool that helps us all get along and function in society.
But, and this is a huge but, here's the danger. Jung warned that if we start to believe that our mask is our real face, well, we get into trouble. We can lose touch with who we actually are. We basically become puppets of what society expects, and our real, individual self, it never gets the chance to grow.
Okay, so if the persona is just the mask, then what's behind it? To answer that, we have to go way, way deeper. We have to get into one of Jung's most famous and, frankly, most mind-bending ideas. Jung proposed this revolutionary concept he called the collective unconscious. The idea is that we are all born with a kind of shared psychic hard drive. It's like a deep, ancient layer of the mind that holds the memories and experiences of all our human ancestors, connecting every single one of us across time and space. And living inside this collective unconscious are the archetypes. So what are they? They're the universal characters, the primordial patterns that exist in all of us. Think of them as the original blueprints for all the great stories. The hero, the villain, the wise old man, the great mother. They're all in there.
Now, this might sound a little out there, but Jung made it feel incredibly real. He put it like this. Just as a spider instinctively knows how to build a perfect web without ever being taught, we are born with these psychic patterns. For him, an archetype is basically the mind's version of a biological instinct. It's just built in.
A shared mind space? Primordial characters downloaded into our brains at birth? I know, it sounds a lot more like science fiction than psychology, but Jung believed he stumbled upon some pretty compelling proof, and he found it in a place you would never, ever expect. So picture this. Jung is working at a psychiatric hospital. He has a patient, a man diagnosed with schizophrenia, who tells him about this incredibly specific, really bizarre hallucination. He said that he could look up at the sun, and if he looked hard enough, he could see its phallus, and that when this thing swung back and forth, it created the wind. A totally unique, strange vision, right? Or so Jung thought. And then, 4 years later, Jung is reading a recently published academic paper about an ancient Greek text, and he just stops in his tracks, because described in this obscure text is the exact same vision, a tube hanging from the sun, and its swinging motion is the origin of the wind. Now, his patient was uneducated. There was no way, absolutely no way, he could have ever seen or heard of this ancient rite. So this just raises a huge, mind-bending question. How is that possible? How could two completely separate minds, thousands of years apart, produce the exact same, highly specific, and pretty weird image? For Jung, there was really only one answer that made any sense: the collective unconscious and its universal archetypes. So let's meet them. Let's get formally introduced to some of the main characters, the key archetypes that are playing a role inside your mind as we speak. So we've already met the persona. That's the mask we show everyone. Well, its direct opposite is the shadow. This is everything we push down and hide from ourselves and others. It's our insecurities, our fears, our less than noble thoughts. But here's the really important part. It's not just our dark side. The shadow also holds our hidden strengths, our raw creativity, our greatest untapped potential, all the things we might be too scared or too conditioned to embrace. Jung said that turning around and consciously facing your shadow is the first test of courage on the journey to becoming a whole person. Because if we don't, we just end up projecting all that stuff onto other people. We start seeing faults in everyone else that are actually secretly our own. All right, next up we have the anima and the animus. Jung's idea here was that we all contained an inner opposite. For a man, the anima is his unconscious feminine side. It's what shapes his moods, his feelings, his capacity for real connection. For a woman, the animus is our unconscious masculine side, which influences her thinking, her reasoning,
and her opinions. Jung believed that getting to know this other inside us is absolutely crucial for self-understanding. So we've got a public mask, a hidden shadow, an inner opposite. It sounds like a lot of different conflicting parts, right? So what's the whole point of all this inner drama? Well, for Jung, the entire point is integration. The goal is to bring them all together into a unified whole. And this brings us to what Jung called the most important archetype of them all, the self. Now, this is not your ego. It's not the you that you think you are from day to day. The self is the organizing center of your entire personality. You could call it the archetype of archetypes. It's the central sun that all the other parts orbit around. And the ultimate symbol of this drive towards wholeness is the mandala. You've seen these intricate designs, right? A circle inside a square, found in cultures all over the world. For Jung, these weren't just pretty pictures. They were spontaneous expressions of the psyche's deep, deep striving for unity, order, and completion. So think of the self not as a thing you achieve, but as the destination of a lifelong journey. It represents that feeling of wholeness, that feeling of completion. It's where all our inner opposites, our conscious mind and our unconscious, our light and our shadow, are no longer at war, but are finally balanced and unified. This difficult, never-ending process of becoming whole is what Jung called self-realization.
Look, understanding these concepts isn't just some fun intellectual exercise. Jung gave us a roadmap, a way to explore our own vast inner world. So let's just pull it all together real quick. We have the persona, that's the mask we show the world. Hiding behind it is the shadow, all the parts of ourselves we'd rather not see. Then we have the anima or animus, our inner contrary self. And all of these different forces are constantly orbiting around that central archetype, the self, which is the great unifier, always pushing us toward becoming whole. And so, in the end, the question isn't just whether these archetypes are real. The real question is, what are they doing inside you? What role is your persona playing in your life? What hidden strengths are waiting for you in your shadow? Getting to know these inner characters is the first real step to becoming the author of your own story. So, you know the archetypes now. The only question left is, what story are they telling?
So let's talk about what really drives you. I mean, deep down. Is it the ghosts of your past or the dreams you have for your future? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating idea from the psychologist Carl Jung. He argued that it's not one or the other, but this delicate balancing act that's happening at the very core of our personality.
You know, this isn't some new age question. It's a debate that has puzzled thinkers for centuries. Are we just products of everything that's already happened to us, kind of stuck being shaped by our history? Or are we actively being pulled toward who we want to become, guided by some vision for the future? Just take a second and think about your own life. Which one feels more powerful? Is it the stuff that made you who you are? Or is it the vision of who you're trying to be? This question isn't just a thought experiment. It literally created a firestorm in the world of psychology.
And this wasn't just some, polite academic disagreement. No, this was a clash of the titans. You had Sigmund Freud on one side and Alfred Adler on the other, two of the most influential thinkers of their time, and they had completely different answers to this question.
Okay, so first up, you've got Freud and his big idea, causality. For him, your personality is kind of like a line of dominoes. The things that happen to you in childhood, especially in those first few years, well, that's the first domino getting pushed. And your adult life, that's just the rest of the dominoes falling in a line. For Freud, the past doesn't just influence you, it basically causes who you are today.
But then, Alfred Adler came along and just completely flipped the script with his idea of teleology. He said, no, we're not pushed by the past. We are pulled by the future. Think about it like a ship at sea. Adler would say, what matters isn't the wake you're leaving behind. It's the lighthouse in the distance that you're steering towards. It's all about your goals, your dreams, your aspirations. So there you have it. Two really powerful but totally opposite ways of explaining what makes us tick. Freud is looking backward, at the cause. Adler is looking forward, to the goal. And it kind of feels like you have to choose, right? Are you just a product of your history, or are you the architect of your own destiny?
But what if the choice itself was the problem? This is where Carl Jung comes in.
He was once Freud's chosen successor, but he looked at this either-or fight and said, wait a minute, and he came up with a third, way more elegant path forward.
Jung basically argued that Freud and Adler were both right, but they were only seeing half of the picture. He thought their views were critically one-sided. To him, trying to explain a whole person with just one of these ideas was like trying to walk a tightrope by leaning all the way to one side. You're gonna fall.
So, Jung's big solution was so revolutionary because it wasn't a choice at all. He said, you know what? We are shaped by both. We are at the same time pushed by the past experiences that made us who we are, and we are pulled by the vision of who we want to become. It's like our past gives us the raw material for our personality, but our future goals are what give that material its shape and its direction.
And Jung put this perfectly himself. He wrote, causal explanations must be balanced with teleological ones. In other words, to really fully understand a person, you have to look in both directions, backwards and forwards. For Jung, a healthy personality doesn't throw out its past, and it doesn't ignore its future. It learns to hold them both in this creative, dynamic balance.
And this whole idea of balance gets even more practical when we look at how Jung thought about personal growth. He saw our psychic energy, our life force, as flowing in two different directions. One is outward, into the world, and the other is inward, into ourselves. And he gave them names, progression and regression.
So first, let's talk about progression. This is your forward-moving, get-it-done, world-facing energy. It's the focus you need to hit a deadline at work. It's the drive that helps you learn a new instrument. It's the part of you that deals with social situations and achieves goals out in the world. It's really the energy of doing.
And then there's regression. Now, I know what you're thinking. That word sounds negative, right? Like you're taking a step backward. But for Jung, it was absolutely essential. Regression is like a strategic retreat inward. It's the energy you use when you step back from a problem to really think, or to listen to your gut feeling, or to understand why you're feeling a certain way. It's not a failure to move forward. It's a necessary step to figure out the right way to move forward.
But does this actually work in a real person's life? Well, the most powerful example we have is Jung himself. He went through this massive midlife crisis that perfectly shows how this dance between growing outward and retreating inward isn't just some abstract theory. It's a necessary part of living a meaningful life.
So here's what happened. First, right at the peak of his career, Jung intentionally turned inward. He stepped away from public life, from all the external success, to focus on his inner world. Next, he just dove deep into his own psyche. This was a profound period of regression where he explored his dreams, his fantasies, his unconscious mind. And finally, he came out of this journey completely transformed. A new man with this balanced, integrated personality that became the foundation for everything else he did. It just proves his point perfectly. That backward step was absolutely necessary for his greatest growth.
So, after all that, what's the big takeaway here? How does any of this apply to you and me right here, right now? Well, it all comes back to that one single crucial word, balance.
Let's just pull all of Jung's keys to growth together. The main idea is that both your past, causality, and your future, teleology, are essential parts of your story. You need them both. And real growth, it requires both that outward action, that progression, and that inward reflection, that regression. If you lean too hard one way, you become one-sided. You're either totally burnt out from always striving, or you're stuck in your own head, never doing anything. The real key to a healthy, whole personality is finding that sweet spot, that dynamic balance.
And really, this might be the most important thing to remember. The goal isn't to choose a direction. It's not past or future, action or reflection. The real goal is to integrate them. It's about learning how to dance between all these different parts of yourself and weaving them together to become a whole, complete person.
And that leaves us with one final question, just for you. As you think about your own journey, your own life, right now, which flow of energy needs more of your attention? Is it the outward push of progression, or is it the inward journey of regression? The honest answer to that question might just be the most important step you can take on your own path to self-realization.
So you've probably been asked this a million times. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? We all have. But what if that's not just the wrong question? What if it misses the whole point? Today, we're going to dive into Carl Jung's work and unpack his idea of psychological types, which is way more of a dynamic blueprint for the mind, not just some simple label. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by moving past that simple introvert/extrovert idea. Then, we'll get into the 2 core attitudes that direct our psychic energy and the 4 mental functions we use to deal with the world. We'll see how all those pieces click together to make 8 different psychological types. And finally, we'll talk about how this all creates a kind of hierarchy inside your own personality.
Okay, first up, let's get beyond the basic labels we all know and use. It's time to really take apart one of the most common and honestly, one of the most misleading ideas about who we are. It always comes down to this question, doesn't it? It feels like you have to pick a side, choose a team for life. But for Carl Jung, yeah, he thought that was looking at it all wrong. Here's Jung's big insight. It's not about what you are, it's about where your energy, your focus and attention naturally goes. He called this your attitude. Think of it as your default setting for engaging with the world. So let's look at the 2 main directions that energy can flow. And that brings us right to the 2 core attitudes that steer our energy. And yep, they're the ones you've already heard of. Introversion and extroversion. But maybe not quite in the way you're thinking. For Jung, introversion is all about your psychic energy turning inward. It's a focus on your own subjective, internal world of thoughts, dreams, and ideas. Extroversion? It's the complete opposite. That same energy turns outward, focusing on the objective world of people, places, and things. The key thing here is it's not about being shy versus outgoing. It's about where your psychic home base is. And for Jung, this wasn't just some abstract theory. This was deeply personal. He went through this intense period in midlife where he just plunged into his own mind, a state of extreme introversion. He had these wild visions and dreams, things he later described as the stuff of psychosis. He literally had to force himself to keep one foot in the real world, seeing family, carving stone, just to stay grounded. It just shows you how powerful these forces really are inside all of us. So what's the end goal of all this? Balance. Jung believed a healthy personality isn't about being 100% one or the other. This teeter-totter visual is perfect for it. Being stuck on one end, way over in the introverted camp, or way over in the extroverted one, well, that's an imbalance. The real goal is to be psychologically flexible, to be able to move between your inner and outer worlds with ease. Okay, so if introversion and extroversion are about the direction our energy flows, what happens then? What is that energy actually doing? Well, Jung identified 4 fundamental functions, 4 different tools we use to perceive and engage with everything around us. So, Jung broke it down like this. First, you have sensing. That's your 5 senses telling you, hey, a thing exists. Simple enough. Then comes thinking. That's your brain trying to recognize what that thing is. After that, you've got feeling, which helps you decide its value or worth to you. And finally, there's intuiting. This is that gut feeling, that hunch. It's when you just know something, but you can't really explain how or why. Now, wait a second, because we have to pause right here on one of these. It's the most misunderstood one of the bunch. When Jung says feeling, he is not talking about emotion. In his system, feeling is a rational process. It's about evaluating something. Is this good or bad? Do I like this or not? Emotion, on the other hand, is the separate, physical reaction that might happen because of that feeling. That's a really critical distinction to make. So, we've got our 2 attitudes, the direction of our energy, and we have our 4 functions, the ways we process things. Now it's time to put them together. This is exactly how Jung built his 8 core psychological types. And this gives us our magic number 8. Where is it from? The math is actually super simple. You take the 2 attitudes, introversion and extroversion, and you combine each one with the 4 mental functions. 2 times 4 gets you 8. 8 basic psychological types. And this table shows you what that actually looks like. You mix an attitude with a function, and bam, a distinct personality type emerges. Let's just take thinking. An extroverted thinking type points that logic toward the outside world. They're all about facts and data. That's why you find research scientists or accountants here.
But an introverted thinking type, they point that same logic inward, building these big subjective ideas, making them more like philosophers. It's the same core function, but the direction of that energy changes everything. All right, this brings us to the last and maybe most crucial piece of the blueprint: hierarchy. We all have all of these functions inside us, so how do they actually work? Who's in charge? Here's how it all comes together. We don't use all 4 functions equally, not even close. Most of us rely on one dominant or superior function. It's our go-to, our comfort zone. We might develop a good backup, a secondary function, but that means the other 2 tend to get neglected. Jung called these our inferior functions. And for him, the whole goal of life, what he called self-realization, was the journey to consciously develop those weaker functions and become a more complete, whole person. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Looking at those 4 functions, sensing, thinking, feeling, and intuiting, which one do you rely on the most? Which one is your default setting? And more importantly, what kind of new perspectives could open up for you if you made a real effort to engage with the ones you use the least?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly special, a guide to human development from the one and only Carl Jung. Now, this isn't just some abstract theory. He literally gave us a map for understanding the entire journey of our lives. So, let's get into it.
I want to kick things off with a question that really gets right to the heart of what Jung is talking about. What if everything you've done up to this point, your career, your relationships, who you think you are, is just a warm-up act? Jung believed the second half of life, the part that starts around 35 or 40, is where the real work and the real growth actually begins.
And here's how he illustrated it, which is just brilliant. Jung saw our lives reflected in the path of the sun. It rises, it climbs up to its highest point, and then it begins to descend. Each part of that journey has its own purpose, its own unique light, and its own set of challenges. This sun metaphor, well, that's the map we're going to be following today.
All right, so our journey starts in the morning of life. Just like the sun rising and getting higher in the sky, this is a time of ascent. The focus here is almost entirely on the outside world, growing, learning, and really building the foundation of the person we're about to become.
Jung breaks childhood down into 3 really fascinating stages. First up is what he called the anarchic phase. Just picture a baby's awareness. It's like these chaotic little islands of consciousness that aren't connected yet. Then you get the monarchic phase, and this is where the ego starts to take shape. You ever hear a toddler say, "Charlie wants a cookie"? They're seeing themselves from the outside. Finally, we hit the dualistic phase. The ego gets solid, and the child starts using the word I, finally seeing themselves as an individual. So, after childhood, we move into youth. This is the period from, say, puberty all the way to middle age. The sun is climbing higher, and the goals are pretty straightforward, right? You're trying to break away from your parents, find a partner, build a career, maybe start a family. It's all about intense activity and realizing, hey, the carefree days of just being a kid, they're over.
But here's the catch. There's a major hurdle in this stage that Jung called the conservative principle. It's that really powerful, totally natural temptation to just retreat back into the safety of childhood, to dodge the real problems of being an adult. Overcoming this pull is like the central mission of your youth. If you don't, it can seriously hold you back for the rest of your life.
And that brings us to the great turning point of life, the afternoon. The sun has reached its peak, it's at its zenith, but its journey is about to change direction. For Jung, this isn't the beginning of the end. No way. It's the beginning of a completely new purpose. But it's one that comes with a really critical choice.
And yeah, he actually puts a number on it. He said this psychological shift happens somewhere between 35 and 40. It's that point where the external goals that drove you so hard in the morning of your life, they might start to feel a little hollow, a little less satisfying. The old map just doesn't seem to lead where you need to go anymore.
And Jung himself put it perfectly with this morning. The values and ambitions that were absolutely right and great for you when you were 25 can become a total lie by the time you're 45 if you don't adapt. Trying to run on the morning's program in the afternoon of your life, that's a recipe for a crisis.
So this is where it gets really crucial. You're at a fork in the road. Path 1 is rigidity. You cling desperately to being young, you get fanatical about your old ideals. Path 2 is growth. You let go of those external morning-of-life goals and you start a new journey inward to find a much deeper meaning. This is the great pivot of a human life. As we follow the sun into the evening of life, it begins its descent. Now, our culture tends to see this stage as just decline. But for Jung, this is where things get really interesting. The setting sun illuminates something totally new. The goal is no longer about expanding outward, but about reflecting inward and finding a completely different kind of wisdom.
This brings us to a question that, let's face it, we all wonder about. Our culture pretty much tells us that being afraid of death is perfectly normal. But what did Jung think?
Well, his answer is pretty radical. He said, no, it's not normal. In fact, he argued that if you're afraid of life, you're going to be afraid of death. He believed that death is the natural goal of life. Think about it. A race needs a finish line to have a purpose. Life needs a final destination, and accepting that is what gives the whole journey meaning and fulfillment.
So Jung's view of old age just flips our modern ideas on their head. He famously said that a youthful 70-year-old, someone desperately clinging to youth, is a psychological monstrosity because they're refusing to live in their actual life stage. The goal isn't to look backward. It's to find a new, deeper purpose. To listen to the secrets of the brooks, as he put it, just means looking inward, finding meaning in the natural flow of life itself, not in some external prize. And this is probably why he found that the dreams of the elderly are so often filled with these powerful symbols of renewal and rebirth, not endings.
All right, so after all this, the morning, the afternoon, the evening, if we follow this map all the way through, where are we actually heading? What's the final destination? For Jung, it's a state he called self-realization. Self-realization, or what he also called individuation, is simply the process of becoming a whole person. It's all about integrating the opposites within you, your conscious mind and your unconscious, your introverted side and your extroverted side, your masculine and feminine energies, and bringing them all together into one unified whole. The ego, that I we work so hard to build in childhood, it kind of takes a back seat. The deeper, whole self becomes the new center of your personality.
So what does this person even look like? Well, for starters, they've dialed way back on their persona. That's the social mask we all wear. They've also faced their shadow, which are all the parts of themselves they don't like or try to hide. They've found a balance between being introverted and extroverted, and they've acknowledged their inner feminine or masculine side, what Jung called the anima or animus. Look, it's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole by bravely owning every single part of yourself.
But now, I gotta be real with you. Jung made it very clear this is not some walk in the park. This state of self-realization, it's rare. It takes an incredible amount of courage to stop running from yourself and to actually turn around, look inward, and face everything that's in there. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
And so, to wrap this up, I want to turn Jung's map back to you. Just take a second and think about it. According to this map, where is your sun in the sky right now? Are you in the morning, the afternoon, or the evening? And maybe more importantly, are you living by the right program for this particular time of day?
All right, welcome back. Today, we're going to open up the toolkit of one of psychology's most incredible figures, Carl Jung. We're diving into the pretty wild and sometimes controversial methods he dreamed up to map the huge, hidden territories of the human mind. So let's get into it. So let's just start with a massive question. How do you even begin to explore the hidden parts of yourself? You know, the stuff that drives your feelings, your gut reactions, even what you dream about at night. This was the central obsession for Carl Jung, and the tools he built to answer that question were honestly nothing short of revolutionary. You know, this quote just says it all, doesn't it? It gets right to what made Jung's whole approach so different. He wasn't just some detached scientist in a lab coat. He really believed that to get a handle on the psyche, you had to use your entire self, your brain, for sure, but also your emotions, your intuition. His work was super personal. It was an exploration of his own soul just as much as anyone else's. You really have to think of Jung as an explorer, a kind of cartographer of the soul.
He saw himself as a scientific investigator. Yeah, but he absolutely refused to be boxed in by just one field. He was pulling his maps from everywhere: history, mythology, philosophy, even alchemy, basically chasing knowledge wherever it led him.
Okay, so the first tool we're pulling out of his kit is the word association test. It might sound kind of simple, but in Jung's hands, it became this incredibly powerful detector, almost like a psychological Geiger counter for finding those emotionally charged hot buttons buried deep inside of us. So what was this Geiger counter actually searching for? It was on the hunt for what Jung called a complex. The best way to think of it is like a tangled knot of ideas and images, all supercharged with emotion, all orbiting one central theme. It's basically a raw nerve, that emotional hot button that, when you press it, sets off a way bigger reaction than it should.
And the process itself was just meticulous. A patient would hear a list of, say, 100 different words, and they just have to say the very first thing that popped into their head. But see, Jung wasn't just listening to their answer. He was watching everything: the pause before they spoke, the little shift in their breathing, even the tiny electrical flicker on their skin. He was collecting data that went way beyond just the words.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, because the body doesn't lie. When a stimulus word bumped up against a hidden complex, the physical reaction was completely involuntary. A little catch in the breath, a jump in skin conductivity, a sudden blush or a stammer. These things weren't just random. They were all clues that something big was happening right under the surface. And it wasn't just the physical tells. There were verbal ones, too, like a really long, awkward pause, or suddenly spitting out a bunch of words instead of just one, or sometimes just nothing. No response at all. By pulling all these clues together, Jung could literally draw a map of a person's inner world, pinpointing the exact themes causing trouble, often without the person having any conscious idea they were even there. Okay, now we're going deeper. We've located some of the triggers, so the next tool in the kit takes us into the truly bizarre and symbolic world of our dreams. For Jung, dreams were not just random mental garbage. Nope, they were direct, uncensored messages from the unconscious. Now, Jung famously split with his mentor, Sigmund Freud, and their disagreement over dreams was a huge part of it. Where Freud saw dreams mostly as wish fulfillment and often sexual stuff, Jung saw something way, way bigger. He believed dreams were the psyche trying to wrestle with huge, universal ideas, the unknowable, using a symbolic language that was so much richer than just one single theme. To really wrap your head around Jung's idea of the unconscious, you have to hear about this super important house dream he had. He dreamt he was on the top floor of a house. It felt comfortable, lived in, and he realized this was his conscious mind, his everyday self. But he gets curious, right? So he heads downstairs to the ground floor. And down here, everything was older, with medieval furniture. He understood this to be the next layer down, his personal unconscious, the place filled with memories from his own life, sitting just below the surface of his awareness. But he keeps going. He finds a stone stairway and descends into a cellar. This level was even older, like an ancient Roman room. And Jung felt this represented an even deeper layer of the unconscious, something that wasn't just his. And then finally, he finds a trapdoor that leads down into a prehistoric cave, deep under the house. And in the dirt, he sees these ancient skulls. This was the big aha moment. This wasn't his personal history. This was humanity's history. For him, this was the proof that there's a collective unconscious, a shared, inherited layer of the psyche that all of us have in common. So if dreams are messages coming from the unconscious, Jung developed a way to talk back. It's a technique he called active imagination. And it's a method for consciously and bravely starting a conversation with the figures that pop up from your inner world. The way it works is you start by focusing on an image, maybe from a dream, maybe just a daydream, and you hold it in your mind until it starts to move on its own. But here's the key. Instead of just watching like you do in a dream, you actively follow it. You talk to it. You interact. You're fully conscious the whole time, a willing participant in a conversation with a part of your own mind. And for Jung, this was way more than just a clinical technique. It was a practice that completely changed his life. I mean, as this quote shows, after his own intense period of doing active imagination, he felt like his life wasn't just his anymore. He felt he had this new duty, a responsibility to serve the psyche, this huge inner world he'd discovered. So what's the end game here? All these tools, the word tests, the dream analysis, these inner conversations, what was it all for? Well, for Jung, the ultimate point was to bring all these discoveries together, to bring the conscious and the unconscious into balance through his own unique take on psychotherapy. Jung saw therapy as this journey through 4 stages. It starts with confession, just this simple, powerful relief of sharing a secret. Then you move to interpretation, where you start to understand the why behind it all. After that is education, basically learning how to navigate the outside world with this new knowledge. But that last stage, transformation, that's the most uniquely Jungian part. It's about moving beyond just coping and actually finding your own meaning and becoming your full self. And this really gets to the core of his whole project. For Jung, therapy wasn't just about fixing what's broken. It was also about encouraging people who are already healthy to keep going on their own journey, to work toward wholeness, toward balance, and toward becoming the most complete version of themselves they could be. But Jung also left us with this really powerful warning, one that perfectly captures the awe and respect he had for the psyche. He said, digging around in this inner world is like digging for a well, but you always run the risk of activating a volcano. It's a pretty potent reminder of the immense, untamed power that's lying dormant inside every one of us. Thanks for joining us. Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into maybe the most famous personality framework in the world, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Let's get right into it. So, you've probably taken this test at some point, right? Maybe at school or for a job, and they hand you your 4-lettered type. But did you ever stop and wonder what's really going on behind those letters? And how they might be shaping some really big real-world decisions? Because this is so much more than just a fun online quiz. The company that owns the MBTI pulls in a reported $20 million a year. Millions of people take this test. It's an absolute cultural and economic giant. So first up, let's take a look at how the world's most popular test went from this pretty niche psychological theory to a global phenomenon. Okay, so here's the basic breakdown. The MBTI sorts you based on 4 preferences. First, are you an introvert who gets energized by being alone, or an extrovert who gets energized by people? Second, do you focus on concrete facts, that's sensing, or do you look for patterns and possibilities, that's intuition? Third, do you make decisions based on logic, which is thinking, or on empathy, which is feeling? And finally, the big one they added, do you like life to be settled and decided, that's judging, or do you like to keep your options open, that's perceiving? Put them all together and boom, you get the 16 types. So where is this test actually getting used? Well, one of the biggest places is the corporate world, especially when they're trying to figure out what makes a good leader. And this right here shows one of the key divides in how people manage. You've got your thinking type, who's all about sharp analysis, logic, and making those quick, confident calls. But then you have the feeling type, who's focused on building consensus, encouraging the team, and making sure everyone feels heard. And this is where it gets really interesting because it points to a potential sea change in what we even consider leadership material. For decades, the ideal leader was that decisive, thinking, and judging type. But a recent study in Finland found that business students, the next generation of managers, had a way stronger preference for feeling than the managers in charge today. It suggests we might be moving toward a future where leaders act more like coaches, all about motivation instead of just command and control. But it's not just business suits and boardrooms. The MBTI also reveals some pretty fascinating patterns about faith and about how a certain personality type can end up shaping an entire community. Get this. Research in Australia found a remarkable pattern among volunteer church leaders. A staggering 2 out of every 3 female lay leaders, that's 66%, all share the same sensing, judging, or SJ profile. These are folks who really value concrete facts and love organized, settled environments. The study also found a really interesting difference between the genders. While both men and women leaders tended to be that SJ type, The women showed a strong preference for feeling, for harmony, while the men leaned more towards thinking and pure logic. So, what does this actually mean for a church when it's so heavily shaped by just one personality profile? Well, the upside is stability. You get these really predictable, loyal, and well-organized communities. But the flip side is that they can be pretty resistant to change. They might push away people who question tradition, and you can even get tension when a professional clergy member, who often has a totally different profile, comes in and tries to shake things up. As the researchers put it themselves, churches say they invite everyone, but in reality, the environment they've built means only certain types are more likely to show up and stay. Okay, so we've seen the MBTI used to analyze leaders, to understand whole communities. It's clearly a powerful tool. But here's the crucial turn. How scientifically sound is it? Is this thing actually built on solid ground? And that brings us to the critical scientific look, the case against the MBTI. According to critics, when you really put the MBTI under a scientific microscope, it runs into some major problems. First, the theory isn't actually based on data. It just assumes this true type exists, but there's no proof. Second, the logic is totally circular. The proof that the test works is, well, it's that you agree with your results. And finally, it's not really testable. It doesn't make strong predictions about your behavior that you could actually prove wrong. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a really fascinating paradox about what your true type even is. You've got this paradox, right? On one side, you have a tool that millions of people find incredibly meaningful. It gives them a language to talk about who they are. But on the other side, the scientific community is pointing out that its foundations are, well, pretty shaky. And that really leaves us with the key takeaway from this whole explainer. The MBTI provides a really powerful story that we can tell about ourselves, but that story might not be a scientific fact. So it leads to the final question. If a test can't define you, what does? All right, welcome to the explainer. Today, we're talking about Carl Jung. His ideas, archetypes, the shadow self, they're literally everywhere. From the biggest blockbuster movies to those personality tests we all end up taking online. But with all that massive cultural impact, there's a really critical question that doesn't get asked enough. And here it is, the big question for this explainer. Are his famous, world-changing theories actually good science? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to put his work to the test, using a 6-point scientific report card. But first, we really have to get a handle on the man himself. So that brings us to our first section, genius or mystic. Because before we can judge the work, you have to understand this central conflict in how Jung is seen. You see, a lot of people look at his work and think mystic, right? But that's not how he saw himself, not even close. And Jung was really firm on this point. He insisted that his deep dive into things like religion and mythology wasn't mysticism, it was science. He even made the point that studying these things didn't make him a mystic, any more than Freud's study of sex made him a pervert. From his perspective, he wasn't channeling spirits, he was mapping out the unseen parts of the human mind, and he was doing it with a scientist's map. Okay, so to be fair to Jung, we're going to use a standard set of 6 tests that you can apply to any useful scientific theory. First, does it generate new research? Second, and this one's a biggie, is it falsifiable? Can you actually prove it wrong? Does it help organize what we already know? Is it practical? Is it internally consistent? And finally, is it parsimonious? Is it as simple as it can be? This is basically the report card we're going to use. All right, let's dive into section 2, where we hit it with our first and maybe the biggest test, falsifiability. Can you scientifically prove the core of Jung's work wrong? Let's take a look at the concept that is, without a doubt, the heart of his entire theory, the unfalsifiable dream. And that core, well, that's the big one, the collective unconscious. This is probably Jung's most famous and definitely his most controversial idea. The theory goes that all of us, as humans, have this shared, inherited layer of our unconscious mind, and it's filled with what he called archetypes, these universal symbols and themes like the hero, the mother, the shadow, that have been passed down through all of human history. And right away, we hit a major scientific roadblock. I mean, how do you prove it? The evidence for it came from Jung's own very powerful, very personal inner world, his dreams, his visions. So to accept the collective unconscious, you have to lean more on faith in his experience than on cold, hard, objective data. You just can't really design an experiment to test for something that vast and that personal. And you know what? Jung himself basically admitted this wasn't about logic. He literally said, archetypal statements have nothing to do with reason. They are not rationally grounded. Now, for a philosopher, that's a fascinating statement. But for a scientist, someone who needs a hypothesis they can actually test, well, that's a total dead end. Okay, but hold on. The story isn't quite that simple. Not every piece of Jung's theory has this problem. In fact, there's one major part of his work that absolutely does lend itself to scientific study. And it's a big one. And this is where you see this fascinating split right down the middle of his work. On one side, you've got the collective unconscious. It relies on faith. It's pretty much impossible to test. But on the other side, you have his theory of psychological types. The ideas of introversion versus extroversion, thinking versus feeling. These concepts are things you can actually study, and boy, have they generated a ton of research.
And this is where it gets really familiar for a lot of us. If you've ever taken one of those personality tests that tells you you're an INTJ or an ESFP, well, you've bumped right into Jung's work. That's the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI, and it is built directly on Jung's typology. And just on that one criterion alone, generating research, the theory gets a big check mark, mostly thanks to the MBTI.
Okay, so we know it generates some research. But what about all the other criteria for a useful theory? How does the rest of the theory hold up? Let's check the rest of the report card.
So how does it stack up? Well, for organizing knowledge, it gets a moderate. And that's because it's one of the only psychological theories out there that even tries to make sense of things like mystical experiences. But then we get to practicality, and that's a low. Why? Because outside of actual Jungian therapy, it's pretty hard to apply. It also gets a low on internal consistency, mainly because Jung had a habit of using a bunch of different, often overlapping terms for the same idea. And finally, another low for parsimony, the idea that simpler is better. Let's be honest, Jung's framework is famously complex, maybe way more than it needs to be.
So we've run it through all 6 of our scientific tests. What's the final verdict? It's time to look at that final scorecard. When you lay it all out, the results are pretty clear. As a scientific theory, Jung's work is, well, it's a mixed bag, to say the least. It scores moderately on generating research and on organizing knowledge, but it scores low on 4 other really critical tests: falsifiability, practicality, internal consistency, and parsimony. From a purely scientific point of view, the theory has some major weaknesses.
And that leaves us with this really fascinating question at the end of it all. We've seen how the theory kind of struggles to hold up under a scientific microscope, and yet there is no denying that his ideas give profound meaning, comfort, and a framework for self-understanding to literally millions of people across the globe. So what do you do with that? If a theory doesn't quite pass the scientific sniff test, but it succeeds on a personal, cultural level, how should we value it? What's it really worth? That's something to think about.
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive deep into the mind of Carl Jung and his absolutely fascinating concept of the self. And really, it all kicks off with one simple question. So I want you to really sit with that for a second. Who are you when there's nobody else around to impress? Because for Jung, the answer to that question is way more complex than you'd ever imagine. And it's the key to his entire philosophy of what it means to be a person. Okay, so where do we even start? Well, we'll begin with a self that we think we know, right? The face we show to the world. But as you're about to see, there's a whole world of powerful forces churning just under the surface. At the very heart of Jung's worldview is this idea of tension. He believed we aren't these static, solid things. No, we're a living, breathing balance of opposites. Our whole personality is shaped by this constant push and pull. Think about these pairs. Jung didn't see them as simple on-off switches. It's not like you're either an introvert or an extrovert, full stop. It's more like a set of sliders. We're all this unique, dynamic blend of these fundamental human qualities, always in flux. So the most obvious part of our personality, the piece that we lead with, is what Jung called the persona.
You can think of it as your own personal PR manager. It's the smooth, capable, friendly face you put on for your boss, for your friends, for society. It's the carefully crafted image you want the world to see. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because if this mask, this public face that we spend so much time perfecting, is just a fraction of who we are, well, what makes up the rest? What's going on behind the curtain?
To find out, we have to do something that can be a little scary. We have to peel back that persona and actually meet the parts of ourselves that are hidden away in the deeper and sometimes darker corners of our own minds. The very first thing you bump into down there is what Jung called the shadow. Now, this is where we've stuffed everything we don't like about ourselves. All the weaknesses, the secret desires, the petty thoughts, the things we work so hard to pretend just aren't there. It's the side we hide not just from other people, but from our own conscious self. So here's the crucial thing to understand. The persona and the shadow are in direct opposition. Your persona is your curated light. Your shadow is your repressed darkness. One is the you that you show, the other is the you that you hide. And for Jung, you simply cannot have one without the other. They're a package deal.
And believe it or not, it gets even more complex. As we go deeper, Jung said we find the anima and the animus. This is the idea that inside every man, there's an unconscious feminine aspect, and inside every woman, there's an unconscious masculine one. It's this inner counterpart we all carry. I love this metaphor. It's so powerful. What Jung is saying here is that these unconscious parts of us, the shadow, the anima or animus, they aren't just sleeping. They are active. They're like tenants living in the house of our psyche, and they influence our moods, our choices, who we fall in love with, often without us having any clue. We think we're in charge, but we are definitely not alone at the controls.
Okay, so if we're this complicated jumble of fragmented, conflicting parts, what's the point? What's the end goal? Well, that brings us to the ultimate purpose of this whole inner journey, to somehow bring all these different pieces into a state of harmony.
Jung called this process individuation. And it's so important to get this. It's not a destination you reach like, okay, I'm individuated now. No. It's a courageous, difficult, lifelong quest to face all those hidden parts and slowly, carefully integrate them into a more complete, more authentic version of yourself.
So how does a person even walk this path?
Well, it starts with having the guts to actually look at your shadow and own it. Then it means consciously trying to develop the other parts of yourself, not just relying on the one you're most comfortable with. And for Jung, this was really a task for the second half of life. It's something that often begins in middle age, when the goals of our youth, career, family, start to make way for this deeper work of self-discovery.
But let's be crystal clear about this. Jung did not think this was some easy, feel-good exercise. He was blunt about it. He believed that real individuation takes a level of courage, brutal self-honesty, and resilience that, frankly, most people just don't have. It's the great, difficult work of a lifetime.
But we're not done yet. Jung's map of the self goes one level deeper, beyond our personal story, to the most profound and maybe controversial part of his entire theory. This is where we zoom out to the very foundation of what it means to be human.
Just let that sink in for a second. After all this intense work of digging into your personal, hidden self, what if you found out that some of your most basic instincts and fears didn't actually come from your life at all?
This is Jung's massive idea of the collective unconscious. He argued that every single one of us is born with a kind of psychic blueprint, a software that's been passed down from all of our ancestors. He saw it as a literal biological inheritance, a shared pool of memories and symbols from our deep, common past.
And this isn't just some abstract concept. Jung said this ancient blueprint has real effects on us today. It shapes our deepest, most irrational fears. Think of the common fear of snakes or spiders. It bubbles up in the symbols in our dreams, it drives our creative urges, and it can even be the source of our prejudices. It's like an ancient operating system running silently in the background of our modern minds.
So you might be wondering, okay, that's a wild idea. What was his proof? Well, this quote really gets to the heart of it. After studying myths, religions, and art from cultures all over the globe, he saw the same patterns, the same characters, the same stories, popping up everywhere. To him, our cultural differences were just window dressing. Underneath, we were all profoundly, mysteriously the same. The collective unconscious was the only thing that made sense of it.
And so we end right back where we started. But the question just feels bigger now, doesn't it? The journey inward shows us our personal mask, our personal shadow. But then it reveals this incredible connection to something ancient, something shared by all of humanity, which leaves us with this final, mind-bending question. Where does that shared ancient inheritance stop, and where do you truly begin?